Now let's talk about one of the most unsuccessful German generals of the Second World War, namely Georg Thomas. And you probably go, who? Well, he was in charge of the war economics of the Wehrwirtschaft to a certain degree. And he was also in the military resistance, although some claim he was basically just an opportunist. Now, when it comes to war economics in Germany, I think Justin would call it a dumpster fire. But I personally think calling the Wehrwirtschaft in Germany in the Second World War a dumpster fire is an insult to any respectable dumpster fire. It was just a mess. So first off, there's this primacy of military conduct of war, which I already talked about in one video, which the Germans were focused on. And there was always this discrepancy between the operational guys versus the logistic guys. And on top of that, there was also the military economic professionals versus the civil industrial elite. So like Speer and Todt. So you always had like these fights going on for the military professionals on the economic side and the civilians. And additionally, on top of that, there was also the inter-service rivalry. So when they usually try to do something centralized, then the Luftwaffe said, oh, we want our own thing, and the Kriegsmarine said, oh, we don't want to have to do anything with the army, because the army was the most important part of the Wehrmacht. But usually, yeah, everyone was like, no, we don't want to have this. And there was also a limited amount of influence on the industry and administration from the military economic side. So a lot of problems everywhere. Now let's go back to Georg Thomas. So he served in the First World War and he worked his way up to be a general staff officer. Then, after the First World War, he got into the Reichswehr. And remember, the Reichswehr was very limited. Only 100,000 men were allowed to be in there. So they usually took only the best of the best. As such, he was rather well suited, likely, because, yeah, they could pick from the best of the best. Although some people note that his appearance was more like a professor and less of an officer. And he was one of the few that saw the importance of war economics in the First World War. And he looked at the US as a role model for mobilization during war. And one of the many things he wanted to do was to create some kind of economic general staff. So one that is more focused on the economics, the logistics and everything, and not just on the conduct of war on the military side. And in 1927 he actually got a good position for this. He got a position basically at the center of economic mobilization, and from 1928 to 1933 he also was involved in planning the rearmament and writing a production program and everything else which involved around 350 million Reichsmark. Then in 1933 the National Socialists came into power. And this is very interesting. He traveled to the Soviet Union at this point. Because as you know, as showed in one of my videos before, the Soviet Union and the Reichswehr were working together to circumvent the Versailles Treaty. And he visited there because he wanted to keep the cooperation going, whereas the National Socialists were against it. And he came back and he was really impressed by the Soviet Union and called it a role model for mobilization, for war economics and everything. And I think he talked with Hitler at this one point, and Hitler was basically, it's just Bolshevik propaganda or something along those lines. So additionally, his career took off. So in 1933, 1934, there were several layoffs. And he was basically below a certain level that he wasn't affected by the layoffs of the higher ranking members, and so he could move up with a lot of other people. Now when the military build-up started, there was basically two factions, you could say. There was the one for the Tiefenrüstung, the military build-up in depth, and the others from the Breitenrüstung, the military build-up in the broad sense. And in depth meant for longevity, like building stuff for having more resources, also food for the civilians and everything, so that you can sustain a long war. Whereas Breitenrüstung was basically build as much material as possible, tanks, planes and everything else, to reach a parity with the enemy. And as you can assume, this was more suited for the operations guys, because they want to have their toys, they want to have their tanks, they want to have their planes to engage the enemy as soon as possible if necessary. But he was more on the, okay, let's keep the rearmament in a way limited and look at the economic situation and also on the international requirements. So in many aspects, he was actually against the rearmament, how it was done under the National Socialists, which I covered also in a video. So he was more for a slower build-up, more building up resources and the general infrastructure, and not like building tanks and planes as fast as possible. And in 1934, he had actually a proposal for a Chef der Wehrmachtsrüstung, chief of the Wehrmacht's military build-up. Now, and if you look at this proposal, the powers and the capabilities were basically that Albert Speer in 1943 achieved when he was Minister for War Production and Armament. And why didn't it happen in 1934? Because there was a lot of resistance from the Luftwaffe and also from the Kriegsmarine. As such, only a weaker version was implemented, and there was no strengthening of the economic professionals in the military. Now, as mentioned before, Thomas was against the fast military buildup that happened under the Nazis, and in 1935 he wrote a memorandum to Hitler noting Germany was running out of resources and foreign currency. And he was not the only one that warned about this. There was also one minister and also one high official of the Wehrmacht that warned about this. Now, in 1936, the Vierjahresplan happened under Göring. The Vierjahresplan is basically the 4-year plan, which was focusing on rearmament, but also making the German industry and economy self-sufficient to provide resources and everything else. Here was another problem, that it was breaking already with existing organizations, so everything got more convoluted at this point. And this will continue on. So one main problem for Thomas was that he had no connection to higher Wehrmacht positions. There was one, Blomberg, which was in a huge position, but he was removed in early 1938. And in general, his position was rather weak. So this is why he couldn't get stuff done for the most part. And in 1939, he was against the war. Not that he opposed war in general, but he said, okay, we don't have enough resources. It's way too early. And he wrote again a memorandum. It's quite interesting. He wrote as a requirement in a way, well, we could do it if we have all the resources from Poland and Southeast Europe, which was kind of seen then in some ways, okay, then let's get these resources. Now, as you can probably guess, he didn't prevent the war. But then he was focusing, okay, we need to centralize the resource allocation. And he got vague acknowledgements from various points, but then he pressed the issue and it was basically declined, or some weaker version again was implemented. And he was also for the concentration of production. He wanted a few main core companies to build all the stuff. Yet the Minister for Economics, Funk, was more like, okay, no, we want to have a lot of small companies involved as well. And they actually noted this is bad from the economical standpoint. But we do this for social and political reasons, because else you would have more unemployed people and more problems with various smaller companies that they shut down. So instead of going full rationalization here and say, okay, we switch to full war production and optimize this and concentrate, it was like, no, we want to keep the people in check and make the unemployment doesn't go up. And you can actually see this in the unemployment statistics. There's not much changing in the beginning of the war, while usually something happens in this regard. Now in 1939, 1940, he was also trying to get into the 4-year plans office. And yeah, he was declined, and Hitler noted, yeah, you're a pessimistic logistician, and he wasn't particularly fond of him, as you can imagine. And in 1940 then the Reichsminister for Armament and Munition came in, which was a civilian, Todt, and this was another competition, and there was already the Heereslogistik, the army logistics and everything, so more and more competition and resources and everything. Yeah, again, it gets convoluted again. And as mentioned before, he was rather fond of the Soviet Union in terms of, okay, this is a powerful enemy. And then he had to do basically an assessment of the Soviet Union on their capabilities of fighting, and he wrote an assessment which the historians call a Gefälligkeitsgutachten, a courtesy assessment, where I think the initial one was not so positive, but then he added something, if we win the war fast, then there's no problem there. And another major point here is he was completely complicit here in the exploitation of the occupied territories, also in the food and all the other stuff, with the hunger plan, with the famine plan. So basically he agreed, or he was aware of, that millions of people will die when they pull out all the grain and other stuff from the Soviet Union, from the occupied territories. This is where he became complicit with the war crimes of the Nazis. And basically 1942 was his final year, because then Speer was coming in and he was basically focusing on the civilian industrial elites, and the military control of the industry, which was basically represented by Thomas, was gone. And to make it clear, so you have Thomas, he's a military professional who wants control over the industry, whereas Todt and Speer were civilians who wanted to keep the military out of the production and focus on the self-management of the economy, and also that the CEOs and everything have more to say. And you can see this if you look at the organigrams and the ideas that the militaries had for controlling the economics. The CEOs never showed up or something. And so in the end it was a triumph by the industrial elite to a certain degree, and by the civilians, and not by the military economic arm. In 1943 he was finally dismissed, and this was basically the end of the military economic professionals in Germany. Yet then in 1944 he was incarcerated and he was put in a concentration camp. Why? Because he was widely active from 1939 onwards to 1942 in the military resistance. Now if you look at the resistance and the military resistance against Hitler in the Second World War, there were many different reasons why people joined. For Thomas it was likely not ethnic reasons, because we know he was accomplice in various crimes, for instance with the hunger plan, with getting food out of the occupied territories, and well knowing and noting that likely a lot of people will die to this pulling out of the resources. He was mainly against the regime due to professional reasons, because he saw how they were conducting war, or how they were getting ready for war that would likely lead to a defeat of Germany. So he wanted the war to be conducted in another way, or not started at this early stage or at all. So this was his main motivation for being in the resistance, and he stopped around in 1942 because I think after Stalingrad it was like, okay, the war is lost for him, and he just basically resignated and pulled out of there. And this is very interesting because some historians call him just an opportunist, that he was like making career or something. And I consider an opportunist to be more personal motivated, whereas from what I read, for me it seems like he was more interested in winning the war, which I wouldn't necessarily call opportunistic. But well, different opinions here, so let me know in the comments what you think about this. And he died rather shortly, 1 year after the war in 1946. Now the final question is, of course, was he one of the most unsuccessful German generals in the Second World War? And the answer to this, yeah, very likely. I mean, one main aspect was creating an economic general staff, and again it was declined. Getting control over the industry from the military side, to concentrate the efforts, resource allocation, everything again. The same for the military buildup along economic and foreign affairs limitations, like in a big grand strategy aspect. And in the end, well, basically the war broke out way earlier, the rearmament was done hastily, and in the final end, the civilian got the control of the armament production. So you could say basically everything went the other way that he was proposing it. So in many ways he didn't achieve any of his goals. I mean, he was rather successful career-wise with achieving a general position rather soon. But besides all of that, the main goals which he had from a professional standpoint were all basically failed. And he was dismissed in 1943. So he's likely one of the most unsuccessful Wehrmacht generals of the Second World War. My big thank you here to Jack, who sent me one of the books that I used in this video. And also a big thank you to all my Patreons for supporting me. Thank you for watching and see you next time.